In the winter of 1902, the most terrifying sight at the Casino de Monte Carlo was not a losing bet, but a silhouette. Sitting at the high-stakes table was Grand Duchess Anastasia Mikhailovna, a grandmother of 42, draped in diamonds and visibly, undeniably pregnant. And everyone in the room knew the father could not be her husband, who had been dead for 5 years. They called her the Devil's Grand Duchess. She was a Romanov storm who treated the moral codes of Europe like her personal doormat, flaunting her affairs and gambling away fortunes with a frantic intensity. She lived as if she were untouchable. But history has a cruel way of balancing the books. How did this woman, who once made emperors tremble with her audacity, end up losing her family, her fortune, and her country, left to die in the silence of the very world she had tormented? Anastasia entered the world on July 28, 1860, at the Peterhof Palace outside St. Petersburg, a place of such excessive grandeur that it was designed to crush the human ego. She was the second child and only daughter of Grand Duke Michael Nikolaevich, the younger brother of Tsar Alexander II. This meant that from her first breath, Anastasia was not merely a human being. She was a political asset of the Russian Empire, a piece of flesh woven from the DNA of Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. Her crib was lined with silk, her rattles were made of silver, and her nursery was guarded by Cossacks who would have died before letting a draft touch her skin. But Anastasia was not a typical St. Petersburg orchid. Her childhood was shaped by a radical change in geography that would forever alter her temperament. When she was just 2 years old, her father was appointed viceroy of the Caucasus. The family moved from the frozen, mannered atmosphere of the capital to Tiflis, modern-day Tbilisi, Georgia. This was the wild frontier of the empire, a land of jagged mountains, sweltering heat, and fierce warrior cultures. Here, away from the stifling protocol of the Winter Palace, Anastasia grew up semi-wild. She was one of 7 children, the only girl in a pack of 6 brothers. The Mikhailovici, as this branch of the family was known, were famous for 3 things: their height, their arrogance, and their tightly knit loyalty. Anastasia grew up climbing trees, riding horses astride rather than side saddle, and shouting orders at her brothers. She was tall, dark-haired, and physically dominating, possessing a raw, earthy vitality that was more Caucasian than Russian. She didn't learn the subtle, passive-aggressive arts of the court lady. She learned to command. She was her father's favorite, the sunbeam of a viceroy who ruled with an iron fist. In Tiflis, she was a princess in a fairy tale, adored by the locals, indulged by her parents, and convinced that the world existed solely to please her. But the tragedy of a royal daughter is that childhood is merely a waiting room for the marriage market. The freedom of the mountains was an illusion that expired the moment she turned 18. In 1878, the machinery of dynastic alliance began to turn, and Anastasia was the cog that needed to be fitted into place. Her parents, particularly her mother, Grand Duchess Olga Feodorovna, a woman of formidable ambition and strict German discipline, began the hunt for a husband. This was not a search for love, it was a search for rank. Anastasia was a Grand Duchess of Russia, bringing with her a dowry that could bankrupt a small nation. She could not marry just anyone. The list of candidates was short, and the selection process was brutal. The man chosen for her was Friedrich Franz III, the heir to the Grand Duchy of Mecklenburg-Schwerin. On paper, it was a solid match. He was a future sovereign of a German state, a Protestant, and a cousin of the Romanovs, but in reality it was a pairing of a falcon and a hamster. Friedrich Franz, known to the family as Paul, was a tragic figure. He was kind, gentle, and deeply intellectual, but physically, he was a wreck. He suffered from severe asthma, a weak heart, and a crippling skin condition that forced him to hide from the sun. He was shy, retiring, and terrified of noise. Anastasia, the loud, vibrant Amazon from the Caucasus, looked at this fragile German prince and felt a cold pit in her stomach. He was everything she was not. He represented illness, silence, and containment. She represented health, noise, and expansion. When they met, the chemistry was non-existent. He was overwhelmed by her. She was bored by him. But in the 19th century, boredom was not a valid reason to refuse a crown. The wedding took place on January 24th, 1879, in the Winter Palace. It was a spectacle of Byzantine magnificence. Anastasia walked down the aisle in a dress of silver brocade, so heavy she required help to turn around, draped in the imperial jewels, surrounded by thousands of candles and the chanting of Orthodox choirs. The Tsar stood witness. The cannons fired across the Neva River. It was the zenith of her life as a Romanov. But as she knelt beside the wheezing Friedrich Franz to exchange rings, Anastasia wasn't entering a marriage. She was entering a prison sentence. The cultural shock that followed was violent. After the honeymoon, the couple traveled to Schwerin, the capital of her husband's duchy in northern Germany. If Tiflis was a wild paradise and St. Petersburg a glittering stage, Schwerin was a mausoleum. It was a small provincial city dominated by a gloomy neo-Renaissance castle that sat on an island in a lake. The court was staunchly Lutheran, fiercely conservative, and obsessed with frugality. The Germans looked at Anastasia with deep suspicion. To them, she was the Russian. She was too loud, too tall, too brightly dressed. She spent money with a carelessness that offended their Protestant sensibilities. She refused to convert to Lutheranism, maintaining her Orthodox faith with a stubborn, ostentatious piety that alienated her in-laws. She filled her apartments with icons and incense, creating a Slavic enclave within the German castle. Her life in Schwerin was a suffocating routine of needlework, church services, and silent dinners. Her mother-in-law, the Dowager Grand Duchess Marie, was a stern woman who viewed Anastasia's high spirits as a moral failing. Anastasia wrote desperate letters home to her brothers, describing the deathly silence of the castle, the awful food, the gray skies that seemed to hang over the turreted roof like a lead blanket. "I am dying here," she wrote. "My soul is shrinking." She fulfilled her biological duty with efficient speed. Within the first years of marriage, she produced 3 children: Alexandrine, Friedrich Franz, and Cecilia. She was a fond, if somewhat erratic, mother, but motherhood was not enough to fill the void of her ambition. She was a woman designed for a grand stage, forced to perform in a closet. She began to act out. She spent lavishly on clothes she had nowhere to wear. She redecorated rooms that didn't need redecorating. She picked fights with the court officials over petty breaches of protocol. But Anastasia was intelligent, and she soon realized that direct rebellion would only lead to stricter confinement. She needed an escape route that was unassailable, something that no bishop or chancellor could argue against. She found it in her husband's lungs. Friedrich Franz's asthma was real, and the damp, freezing fog of the Baltic coast was torture for him. He spent the winters gasping for breath, confined to his bed. Anastasia saw his suffering, and while she may have felt pity, she also saw opportunity. She began a campaign of medical advocacy that was relentless. She badgered the court doctors. She insisted that the climate of Schwerin was killing the Grand Duke. She argued that for the sake of the dynasty, for the sake of the heir, they must versa. Her solution was simple, elegant, and self-serving: the South, the Mediterranean. The court in Schwerin resisted. A German sovereign should reside in Germany, they argued. But Anastasia was a Romanov, and she knew how to bulldoze obstacles. She used her own immense wealth to smooth the way. She argued that they would not be abandoning their duty. They would merely be relocating the court for the sake of the sovereign's health. In the mid-1880s, she won. The family began to spend the winters in Cannes, France. The moment the train crossed the border into the south of France, Anastasia Mikhailovna underwent a transformation. As the gray skies of Germany gave way to the brilliant azure of the Riviera, the sullen prisoner of Schwerin vanished, replaced by the glittering Grand Duchess. They purchased a magnificent property, the Villa Venden, nestled in the hills overlooking the bay. For Friedrich Franz, Cannes was a place to breathe. The warm, dry air eased his chest. He could sit in the garden and read his books in peace. But for Anastasia, Cannes was a hunting ground. Here, far away from the disapproving eyes of her mother-in-law and the rigid protocol of the German court, Anastasia built her own kingdom. The Riviera in the late 19th century was the playground of the European elite. Kings, princes, tycoons, and artists gathered there to winter in luxury. It was a society based not on piety, but on pleasure. And Anastasia was its natural queen. She was a physical force. She took up tennis with a ferocity that terrified her opponents. She was not the delicate player who gently patted the ball over the net. She played to win, sweating in her heavy skirts, shouting in Russian when she missed a shot. She embraced the new technology of the age, the automobile. She bought the fastest cars available and drove them herself, tearing along the treacherous, unpaved Corniche roads at breakneck speeds, her veil flying behind her, leaving a trail of terrified pedestrians and scandalized aristocrats in her wake. But her greatest vice, the one that would come to define her, was the green felt table. The Casino de Monte Carlo was the cathedral of the Riviera, and Anastasia became its high priestess. She discovered an aptitude and a hunger for gambling that bordered on the pathological. It wasn't just about the money, though she loved money, it was about the risk. In Schwerin, every day was scripted, every interaction controlled. At the roulette wheel, there was chaos. There was the thrill of the unknown. She would arrive at the casino late at night, dripping in Romanov emeralds, her entourage trailing behind her. She played roulette and trente-quarante, placing bets that equaled the annual salary of a general. When she won, she threw lavish parties, buying champagne for the entire room. When she lost, she was terrifying. She had the Romanov temper. There were whispers of her throwing rakes at croupiers, of her demanding the wheel be spun again, of her imperial arrogance clashing with the rules of the house. But the casino management tolerated her because she was the ultimate attraction. Tourists would come just to see the Russian woman play. She was a spectacle, a force of nature. Yet beneath the glitter and the adrenaline, there was a rotting core to her marriage. Friedrich Franz was fading. He was becoming a ghost in his own villa, a quiet invalid who watched his wife's manic energy with a mixture of love and exhaustion. He knew he could not satisfy her. He knew she was bored. He knew she was lonely in a way that crowds could not fix. Anastasia loved her husband in her own way. She was protective of him. She nursed him when he was ill. But she was a woman of voracious appetites, both emotional and physical. She was in her 30s, the prime of her life, married to a man who was essentially geriatric in body, if not in years. The discrepancy was a ticking time bomb. The freedom of Cannes was intoxicating, but it was also dangerous. It stripped away the protective layers of protocol that usually kept royals from destroying themselves. In Schwerin, Anastasia was watched by 100 eyes. In Cannes, she was the one watching. And as the 19th century drew to a close, she began to look for something more dangerous than a tennis match or a roulette wheel. She began to look for a connection that felt real. She found it right under her husband's nose. The Villa Winden was a bustling household filled with servants, tutors, and aides. Among them was a man named Vladimir Paltov. He was a commoner, a Russian, serving as the personal secretary to the Grand Duke. He was handsome, intelligent, and possessed the one thing Friedrich Franz lacked: vitality. He was a man of the world, a man who spoke Anastasia's language, both literally and metaphorically. It started slowly. A shared look across the dinner table, a conversation in the garden that lasted too long, a ride in the automobile without the chauffeur. Paltov was deferential, of course. He was a servant, and she was an imperial highness. But Anastasia had never cared for boundaries. To her, boundaries were things other people had to respect. The affair began in the shadows of the sunny villa. It was a reckless, stupid, magnificent transgression. For the first time since leaving Tiflis, Anastasia felt a passion that matched her own intensity. She was risking everything: her title, her children's future, her husband's honor, for the touch of a secretary. By the turn of the century, the whispers in Cannes were becoming a roar. The servants talked. The local society matrons gossiped behind their fans. Have you seen how the Grand Duchess looks at the secretary? Have you seen how late he leaves her chambers? Anastasia didn't care. She was addicted to the adrenaline of the illicit. She felt invincible. She was the granddaughter of a czar. Who would dare tell her no? But biology does not respect rank. In the early months of 1902, Anastasia missed her cycle. Then she missed another. The sickness came in the mornings, the tightening of the dresses. She was 41 years old. She was pregnant. And her husband, the Grand Duke, had not shared her bed in years. The game was up. The golden cage she had escaped had been replaced by a trap of her own making. But, as the reality of her situation set in, Anastasia Mikhailovna did not weep. She did not plan a trip to a Swiss convent to hide the shame. She looked in the mirror, lit a cigarette, and decided to do the impossible. She wasn't going to hide the bastard. She was going to make him account. But the scandal was not just infidelity. It was timing. The tragedy, or perhaps the liberation, had begun 5 years earlier. On April 10th, 1897, the fragile pillar of her life collapsed. Grand Duke Friedrich Franz III suffered a catastrophic event at the villa in Cannes. The official report stated that, gasping for air during an asthma attack, he stumbled onto the terrace, climbed the garden wall seeking the breeze, and fell to his death on the road below. Darker whispers suggested suicide. Whatever the truth, the buffer was gone. Anastasia was a widow at 36. She was free. But freedom is dangerous. Without a husband to answer to, she kept his personal secretary, Vladimir Paltov, by her side. And in 1902, the unthinkable happened. The Dowager Grand Duchess, the mother of the reigning Grand Duke of Mecklenburg-Schwerin, was pregnant. On December 23, 1902, in Nice, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy. She named him Alexis Louis. The birth was a geopolitical disaster. In Berlin, Kaiser Wilhelm II was apoplectic. In St. Petersburg, the Tsar was horrified. A Grand Duchess had birthed a bastard. It was the kind of scandal that usually ended with the woman being locked in an asylum. But Anastasia did not hide. She summoned her son, the young Grand Duke Friedrich Franz IV, now the ruler of the state. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She issued a command. She demanded that he use his sovereign power to ennoble his own illegitimate half-brother. Under immense pressure from his domineering mother, the young Grand Duke agreed. He granted the boy the title Count of Winden. By doing so, Anastasia had effectively woven her sin into the fabric of the dynasty. She had forced the legitimacy of her bastard down the throats of the aristocracy. The funeral train that carried the Grand Duke's body back to Germany was a somber iron snake winding its way north. Anastasia traveled with it, dressed in the deepest black mourning weeds. She looked the part of the grieving widow, but behind the heavy crepe veil, her mind must have been racing. She knew what was waiting for her in Schwerin. The funeral in the gloomy cathedral of Schwerin was a frosty affair. The German relatives looked at Anastasia with eyes of ice, but the true hammer blow came from Berlin. Kaiser Wilhelm II did not attend the funeral merely to pay respects. He came to settle a score. He blamed Anastasia for everything, for Friedrich Franz's misery, for the pollution of German noble blood, for the scandal of the Count of Venden. He looked at the flamboyant Russian widow and decided she would not be allowed to corrupt the next generation. Her son, Friedrich Franz IV, had become Grand Duke in 1897, while still a teenager, leaving the family's power dynamics even more precarious. Wilhelm took the boy aside. He poisoned him against his mother. He told him that Anastasia was a moral cancer, that her influence would destroy his reign, just as it had destroyed his father's life. The decree came swiftly. Anastasia was informed that she was no longer welcome in Mecklenburg-Schwerin. She could keep her title of Dowager Grand Duchess. She could keep her money, which was mostly Russian anyway. But she could not live in the country. She was effectively exiled from the land her son ruled. But the Kaiser went further. He insisted that her youngest daughter, Cecilia, a beautiful tall girl who was being groomed as a bride for the German crown prince, be removed from her mother's care. Cecilia was to be raised in the German way, far from the gambling tables and the loose morals of the Riviera. Anastasia fought back. She screamed. She threatened. She appealed to the Tsar. But the Tsar, Nicholas II, was equally disgusted by the Count of Wendien affair. He offered no support. The Romanovs, usually so fiercely loyal to their own, washed their hands of her. Defeated, Anastasia retreated to the only place that had ever felt like home, France. She returned to the Villa Venden, but the victory of her earlier years had turned to ash. She was a widow, an exile, and a pariah. The lover, Vladimir Paltov, faded from the picture, his purpose served, his presence now a liability. The little Count of Wenden, Alexis, remained with her, a living reminder of the scandal that had cost her a kingdom. The years between 1905 and 1914 were a strange twilight existence for Anastasia. She was still fabulously wealthy. She still held court in Cannes, but the laughter was brittle. She became more aggressive, more erratic. Her gambling addiction spiraled out of control. The Casino de Monte Carlo became her true home. She was there almost every night, a towering figure in black. She often wore mourning colors even years later, perhaps as a dramatic affectation. Chain-smoking, betting amounts that made the oil tycoons of America blush. She became a caricature of the mad Russian royal. She would commandeer the best tables in restaurants. She would drive her automobiles at terrifying speeds through the winding streets of Ys and La Turbie. She was trying to outrun the silence, trying to fill the void left by the loss of her power. She was also a mother watching her children drift away into the very machine she hated. Her daughter, Alexandrine, had married the future king of Denmark, disappearing into the quiet dignity of the Scandinavian court. And her favorite, Cecilia, had indeed married the German crown prince, becoming the future empress of the very nation that had exiled Anastasia. It was a bitter irony. Anastasia, the woman who hated Germany, was now the mother of its future Kaiserin. When she visited Berlin for the wedding, she was treated with cold, formal politeness, kept in the background, like an embarrassing relative. She watched Cecilia wave from the palace balcony, a prisoner in the same gilded cage Anastasia had spent her life breaking out of. She will learn, Anastasia might have thought. They all learn eventually that the gold is just paint on the bars. But the world was changing faster than Anastasia could drive her car. The old Europe of kings and casinos was sleepwalking toward an abyss. In the summer of 1914, Anastasia was in London, visiting her relatives, enjoying the last great season of the Edwardian era. The champagne flowed, the orchestras played, and the aristocracy danced, unaware that the music was about to stop forever. When the news of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand's assassination broke in June, few thought it would lead to Armageddon. But Anastasia, with her sharp political instincts honed in the Caucasus and St. Petersburg, felt the tremor. She rushed back to France, to her villa, to her sanctuary. But sanctuary is a political concept, and war ignores borders. In August 1914, the guns of August roared. Germany invaded Belgium. Russia invaded Germany. France mobilized. Britain declared war. Overnight, the map of Europe, a map that was essentially Anastasia's family tree, caught fire. And Anastasia Mikhailovna, the Grand Duchess of Russia, the Dowager Grand Duchess of Mecklenburg-Schwerin, the mother of the German Crown Princess and the Queen of Denmark, found herself in a position of terrifying vulnerability. She was a Russian by birth. Russia was at war with Germany. She was a German by marriage. Germany was at war with France. She was living in France. To the French, she was a German spy. To the Germans, she was a Russian enemy. To the Russians, she was a traitor who had married a German. She was trapped. The French government, gripped by spy mania, looked at the Villa Vinden with suspicion. Who was this woman who spoke German to her maids, Russian to her children, and French to the croupiers? Why did she have a telegraph machine? Why was she sending letters to Berlin? During World War I, her position became untenable in France. She withdrew to neutral Switzerland, living in Lausanne, as her family found itself split across enemy lines. She sat in her darkened drawing room, listening to the distant rumble of artillery, holding the hand of her illegitimate son, the Count of Wenden. The world she had manipulated, the world she had scammed and charmed and bullied, had finally snapped. The chips were down, the wheel had stopped spinning, and for the first time in her life, Anastasia Mikhailovna didn't know the odds. The outbreak of World War I was not just a geopolitical catastrophe for Anastasia. It was a personal dismantling of her identity. She was a woman defined by her connections, and suddenly, those connections were crimes. She wrote desperate letters to her daughter Cecilia in Berlin, but the letters were returned or censored. She tried to wire money to her brothers in St. Petersburg, but the lines were cut. She was isolated in a way she had never been before. The Devil's Grand Duchess was just an old woman in a drafty villa, rationing coal and wondering if her son was bombing her brothers. But as she looked out at the darkened Mediterranean, she could not have known that the war was only the beginning of the horror. In the east, a storm was gathering that would make the Kaiser's wrath look like a lover's quarrel. The Romanovs were not just going to lose a war, they were going to lose their existence. And Anastasia, safe in her French prison, would be forced to watch the extinction of her bloodline from the front row. The Great War turned Europe into a slaughterhouse. But for Grand Duchess Anastasia Mikhailovna, it was a hall of mirrors where every reflection showed a different betrayal. By 1915, her position in France had become untenable. The French government, paranoid and reeling from the trenches, could no longer tolerate the presence of a German Grand Duchess on the Riviera, even one who swore she hated the Kaiser. She was a security risk. Her letters were opened, her movements tracked, her very existence, an affront to the mothers sending their sons to die against German machine guns. With heavy heart, she packed her trunks. She did not return to Russia. The route was blocked by war. She could not go to Germany. She was in exile there. So she did what all displaced royals did when the world caught fire. She went to Switzerland. She settled in the neutral, sterilized luxury of the Savoy Hotel in Lausanne. It was a gilded cage far smaller than the Villa Wenden, but safe from the artillery shells. Here, she lived a life of surreal suspension. The hotel was filled with other refugees of high rank, deposed kings, fleeing princes, and spies of every nationality whispering in the lobby. Anastasia held court in her suite, playing cards to pass the time, chain-smoking and waiting for the telegraph boy to bring news that would either save her or destroy her. Her internal war was as violent as the one on the Western Front. Her son, Friedrich Franz IV, was a general in the German army, commanding troops on the Eastern Front. Her brothers, the Grand Dukes Nicholas and George Mikhailovich, were generals in the Russian army. In the brutal calculus of 1916, her son was trying to kill her brothers, and her brothers were trying to kill her son. She would sit by the window looking out over Lake Geneva, a newspaper in her lap, reading the casualty lists. Every victory for Germany was a knife in her heart for Russia. Every victory for Russia was a terror for her son in Germany. She was a mother and a sister torn apart by the flags she had been born under and married into. She stopped sleeping. The vibrant, domineering woman who had terrorized the casinos began to shrink, her eyes growing hollow, her hands shaking as she lit cigarette after cigarette. But the war was only the prologue to the true nightmare. In 1917, the telegrams from St. Petersburg stopped talking about victories and started talking about bread riots, then strikes, then abdication. The Russian Revolution began not with a bang, but with a collapse. When Tsar Nicholas II abdicated in March 1917, Anastasia was initially hopeful. Like many Romanovs, she had been critical of the Tsar's incompetence and the Rasputin influence. She thought perhaps a constitutional monarchy or a republic would bring stability. She thought her family would be allowed to retire to their estates in the Crimea, to live out their days in harmless obscurity. She was wrong. The provisional government fell. The Bolsheviks rose. Lenin arrived at the Finland station, and the color of the revolution turned from gray to blood red. From her hotel room in Switzerland, Anastasia watched in helpless horror as the news filtered out. The Romanov assets were seized. The palaces were looted. Her income, the vast, inexhaustible river of gold that had fueled her gambling and her lifestyle, dried up overnight. She was suddenly a woman with expensive tastes and a frozen bank account. She began to sell her jewelry, piece by piece. The emeralds went first, then the diamonds. The Count of Wenden, her teenage son Alexis, watched as his mother haggled with Swiss jewelers, trading the legacy of Catherine the Great for hotel bills. But money was replaceable. Blood was not. In July 1918, the rumor reached Lausanne that the Tsar, the Empress, and their 5 children had been murdered in a cellar in Ekaterinburg. Anastasia refused to believe it. It was too barbaric. They would not kill the children, she insisted to her fellow exiles. They are monsters, yes, but not that kind of monster. But the silence from the east grew louder. Then came the blow that shattered her. Her favorite brothers, Grand Duke Nicholas Mikhailovich, the historian of the family, and Grand Duke George Mikhailovich, along with her cousin Dmitry Konstantinovich, had been arrested. They were not sent to Siberia. They were held in the fortress of Peter and Paul in St. Petersburg, the very fortress whose golden spire Anastasia had looked at from her nursery window. Anastasia tried to intervene. She used her contacts. She wrote to the Red Cross. She wrote to authors and diplomats. She tried to leverage her German connections, hoping the Kaiser might trade prisoners. But the Kaiser was losing his own war, and the Bolsheviks were not interested in trades. They were interested in liquidation. In January 1919, the news arrived. It was a cold, gray morning in Lausanne. A courier brought a report confirmed by British intelligence. On January 28, 1919, inside the walls of the fortress, her brothers had been led out into the courtyard. They were stripped to their shirts in the freezing cold. Grand Duke Nicholas, ever the intellectual, had been holding his favorite cat. He tried to give it to a soldier for safekeeping. The execution squad fired. They threw the bodies into a mass grave. Anastasia Mikhailovna, the woman who had defied the moral codes of Europe, the woman who had birthed a bastard and made him a count, the woman of iron will, finally broke. She collapsed in her suite. She didn't scream. She simply disintegrated. The Romanov dynasty wasn't just a political system to her. It was her flesh. It was her childhood in Tiflis. It was the smell of incense in the Winter Palace. And it was gone, erased. The grief was compounded by the simultaneous collapse of her other world. In November 1918, Germany had surrendered. The Kaiser abdicated and fled to Holland. The German Empire was dissolved. Her son, Friedrich Franz IV, was forced to abdicate his throne in Schwerin. Her daughter, Cecilia, the crown princess who was supposed to be empress, was now just a citizen of a broken republic, living in a country ravaged by revolution and inflation. By 1920, Anastasia was a survivor of a shipwreck that had drowned everyone else. She was 60 years old. She had lost her brothers to firing squads. She had lost her husband to suicide or accident. She had lost her fortune to linen. She had lost her social standing to the war. She gathered the remnants of her life and decided to leave Switzerland. The neutrality was suffocating. She wanted to go home, not to Russia. Russia was a graveyard. Not to Germany. Germany was a ruin. She wanted the Villa Wenden. She wanted the sun. She returned to France in 1921, but the Riviera had changed. The pre-war elegance was gone, replaced by the frantic, desperate energy of the Jazz Age. The Roaring Twenties were beginning, populated by American heiresses and war profiteers. The Grand Dukes were now driving taxis in Paris. The Countesses were sewing lingerie. Anastasia reopened the Villa Wenden. It was dusty. The gardens were overgrown. She had to run it with a skeleton staff. She didn't have the money for the lavish parties anymore. She didn't have the money for the high-stakes tables at Monte Carlo, though she still went, haunting the casino like a ghost, placing small bets with trembling hands, her once fearsome glare dimmed by cataracts and sorrow. She lived for her children now. She worried incessantly about Alexis, the Count of Wenden, who was now a young man of 19, a prince, without a kingdom, a count of a non-existent duchy. And she worried about Cecilia. Cecilia, once the golden girl of the German court, was now living a difficult life in Potsdam. Anastasia longed to see her, but the French government was still hostile to Germans. Travel was difficult. In early March 1922, Anastasia was at her villa in Ise, a small hilltop village near Nice. She was planning a party. Even in ruin, she couldn't stop being a hostess. She was organizing a costume ball for her friends, a last gasp of the old gaiety. But the body keeps the score. The years of stress, the chain smoking, the manic gambling, the grief. It had all taken a toll on her heart. She began to feel unwell. She blamed it on the food, on the weather. She refused to see a doctor. "I am a Romanov," she would say. "We do not get sick. We only die." On March 8th, she received a letter from Germany. It brought news of the sudden death of her brother-in-law. Or perhaps it was a delayed confirmation of the gruesome details of her brother's execution. The specifics are lost, but the impact was clear. The past reached out one last time to strike her. She went to bed early on the night of March 10th, complaining of a headache. The Mediterranean wind rattled the shutters of the villa. The lights of the casino flickered in the distance, a beacon she could no longer reach. Anastasia Mikhailovna lay in her bed, the darkness of the room pressing in on her. She was a woman who had lived 3 lives: the wild princess of the Caucasus, the prisoner of Schwerin, and the queen of the Riviera. She had broken every rule. She had loved a servant. She had defied a Kaiser. She had outlived an empire. But as she closed her eyes, she was not the Grand Duchess. She was just a tired woman who missed her brothers. She missed the sound of their boots in the hall. She missed the smell of the pine forests in Tiflis. In the silence of the French night, the stroke hit her massive, catastrophic, and swift. There was no time for a final bet. Once she set it in motion, there was no graceful exit. When the maid entered the room on the morning of March 11th, 1922, she found the Grand Duchess cold. The cigarette in the ashtray had burned down to ash, a long gray finger pointing at nothing. The barkeep of the Riviera had served her last drink. The funeral of Grand Duchess Anastasia Mikhailovna in March 1922 was a surreal study in diminished grandeur, a stark contrast to the noise and brilliance of her life. She was buried in Ludwigslust, next to her husband Friedrich Franz III, the man she had tormented, manipulated, and ultimately outlived. But the gathering at the graveside was not a congregation of imperial power. It was a reunion of survivors. The mourners who stood in the biting German wind were the debris of the First World War. Deposed kings, exiled princes, and weeping aristocrats who had lost their thrones, their fortunes, and their countries. The woman who had once stopped traffic in Monte Carlo with her emeralds was laid to rest in a world that had no more use for emeralds, only for bread. But the true drama of Anastasia's death was not in the coffin. It was in the reading of the will. For decades, the Devil's Grand Duchess had been the bank of last resort for her family. Her spending was legendary, her gambling losses astronomical. But everyone assumed the Romanov well was bottomless. It was not. When the lawyers finally untangled the estate, the truth was a shock. The well was dry. The Bolsheviks had seized her Russian assets, the land, the palaces, the imperial rent rolls. The German hyperinflation was eating away at what was left of her Mecklenburg dower. Anastasia Mikhailovna, the woman who had lived as if she owned the sun, had died leaving little more than a villa full of dusty furniture and a mountain of memories. This revelation fell hardest on the one person who had no other safety net, her illegitimate son, Alexis, the Count of Winden. At 19 years old, Alexis was a young man constructed entirely of his mother's defiance. He had been raised in the lap of luxury, educated by tutors, and treated as a prince in all but name. But with Anastasia gone, his protection evaporated. He was a count of a non-existent county, a son of a Grand Duchess who left him no fortune, and a stepbrother to a Grand Duke who was now a private citizen. The scene in the lawyer's office must have been excruciating. Alexis stood across from his half-brother, Friedrich Franz IV, and his half-sister, Crown Princess Cecilia. They were the legitimate heirs, the ones with the royal bloodlines. Even if they had lost their crowns, he was the mistake. To their credit, the legitimate children did not cast him out. Friedrich Franz IV continued to pay him a small allowance, honoring the promise made to their mother. But the party was over. Alexis Louis de Winden did not become a playboy of the Jazz Age. He faded into the gray obscurity of post-war Paris. He would live out his life as a quiet, somewhat tragic figure, a man who carried the DNA of the Romanovs, but worked for a living ghost of a scandal that no longer mattered. But if Alexis's fate was one of quiet fading, the fate of Anastasia's favorite daughter, Cecilia, was a spectacular, agonizing crash. Cecilia's story did not end in fairy tale grandeur. The empire collapsed, her role evaporated, and she spent the rest of her life navigating exile, loss, and the long aftershock of defeat. Crown Princess Cecilia had been raised by Anastasia to be an empress. She was tall, fashionable, and beloved by the German people. She had married the heir to the Hohenzollern throne, expecting to reign over the greatest empire in Europe. Instead, she reigned over a ruin. When the German Empire collapsed in 1918, Cecilia's life was shattered. Her husband, Crown Prince Wilhelm, was a vain and foolish man who followed his father, the Kaiser, into exile, leaving Cecilia alone in Berlin to face the wrath of the revolutionaries. She stood on the balcony of her palace not to wave to adoring crowds, but to watch them burn the symbols of her family. Anastasia's death in 1922 removed the last anchor Cecilia had to the old world. Without her mother's fierce, domineering love, Cecilia drifted. She was stripped of her palaces, her servants, and her purpose. The woman who was supposed to be the Kaiserin became a curiosity, a Frau Hohenzollern, living in a modest country house, struggling to pay for coal. The relationship between mother and daughter had always been complex. Anastasia the rebel, Cecilia the dutiful wife, but in death, their fates aligned. Both were women of immense capacity who were crushed by the gears of history. Anastasia had tried to outrun her destiny at the roulette wheel. Cecilia had tried to endure hers with dignity. Both failed. As the 1920s roared into the 1930s, the darkness that had consumed Anastasia's fortune began to consume Cecilia's soul. She watched as Germany, humiliated and broken, turned toward a new, darker power. She watched her sons be seduced by the rhetoric of the Nazis, hoping to restore the monarchy, only to be used and discarded. She lived to see another war tear Europe apart, to see her palaces bombed, and to flee once again, this time from the Soviets, carrying her few possessions in a suitcase, just as her mother had fled the Villa Wenden. The curse of the Romanovs that Anastasia had carried, the curse of being too rich, too proud, and too blind to the changing tides, had passed to her daughter. Anastasia died of a stroke in a warm bed in France. Cecilia would die years later, impoverished and broken, in a cold spa town in Germany, a relic of an empire her mother had hated but which had defined them both. But the most haunting part of the aftermath was not the poverty or the exile. It was the silence. After the funeral in 1922, the Villa Wenden was sold. The new owners didn't care about the Grand Duchess who had terrified the croupiers. They painted over the Russian icons. They tore up the tennis courts where she had smashed balls with Amazonian fury. The Casino de Monte Carlo, which had practically been her second home, did not erect a plaque in her honor. They simply found new players to fill her seat. Anastasia Mikhailovna had spent her entire life making noise, shouting, laughing, betting, demanding. She had been the sunbeam of Tiflis and the terror of the Riviera. She had believed that her personality was enough to bend reality. But in the end, she left no monument. There is no Anastasia Hospital or Anastasia Foundation. There is only a grave in Germany that she never wanted to be in, and a footnote in the history books about a scandal that everyone has forgotten. The bastard count lived a quiet life and died in 1976, taking the last living memory of his mother's voice with him. The German daughter died in 1954, a refugee in her own land. The wealth was gone, the power was gone, the scandal was gone. All that remained was the story. In the silence of the archives, one can still find the letters Anastasia wrote. They are written in a large, bold hand, full of exclamation points and underlined words. They scream off the page. They demand attention. Even from the grave, she is trying to order us to look at her. "I am not like the others," she seems to shout. "I was alive." And she was. In a family of statues, she was a living, breathing, sinning human being. She was the only Romanov who looked at the rules of the 19th century and said no. She paid a terrible price for that no, the isolation, the ridicule, the eventual oblivion. But for a few decades, she was the freest woman in Europe. As we approach the final chapter of her story, we must ask, was it worth it? Was the thrill of the bet worth the loss of the house? Was the warmth of the Riviera worth the cold shoulder of history? Anastasia never answered that question. She simply placed her chips, spun the wheel, and let the ball fall where it may. To walk through the Casino de Monte Carlo today is to walk through a museum of ghosts. The Belle Epoque architecture still stands, the frescoes still look down from the ceiling with painted indifference, and the air still smells of money and desperation. But the sound has changed. The hushed, terrifying click of the ivory ball has been replaced by the electronic beep of slot machines and the chatter of tourists in denim. The grandeur has faded into kitsch. Yet if you stand very still in the Salle Blanche, you might feel a sudden drop in temperature, a phantom draft of cold air that smells faintly of heavy Turkish tobacco and expensive perfume. It is the lingering spirit of the woman who once owned this room, the woman who sat at the center of the table like a spider in a web of diamonds, daring the universe to take her money. Grand Duchess Anastasia Mikhailovna is largely forgotten by history, overshadowed by the more famous tragedies of her family: the murdered Tsar, the hemophiliac heir, the imposter Anastasia. She is a footnote, usually dismissed with a few derogatory adjectives: the eccentric, the gambler, the scandal. But to dismiss her is to miss the point of her existence. Anastasia was not just a colorful character, she was a diagnostic tool for the sickness of the European aristocracy. She was the fever that proved the body was dying. In the final analysis, her life forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about the golden age of royalty. The good ones died screaming, and the bad ones died in bed. Consider the contrast between Anastasia and her cousin-in-law, Empress Alexandra Feodorovna, Alex. Alex was the perfect royal wife. She was pious, devoted to her husband, obsessed with her children, and morally rigid. She hated gambling, hated frivolity, and spent her life praying. And what was her reward? She was vilified by her people, imprisoned by revolutionaries, and butchered in a basement in Ekaterinburg. Her virtue did not save her. It merely made her a pristine victim. Anastasia, on the other hand, was everything a royal woman was not supposed to be. She was loud, unfaithful, greedy, and selfish. She neglected her duties in Germany to party in France. She cuckolded her husband and legitimized the result. She burned through a fortune that could have fed a city. And her reward? She lived 61 years of unapologetic freedom. She felt the sun on her face every day. She loved who she wanted. She died peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by silk sheets, having outlived the empires that tried to control her. In a Darwinian sense, Anastasia was the fittest. She understood, perhaps instinctively, that the old rules of duty and honor were a suicide pact. She saw that the monarchy was a theater piece that was running out of audience, and she decided that if the theater was going to burn down, she might as well be at the bar having a drink when it happened. But this survival came at a terrible cost to those around her. This is the dark side of the Anastasia legend, the side that prevents her from being a feminist icon. Her freedom was purchased with the suffering of others. She broke her husband's heart to feed her own ego. She abandoned her duties in Schwerin, leaving her son to be raised by a court that hated him, which ultimately made him weak and susceptible to the Kaiser's bullying. She raised her daughter Cecilia to expect a fairy tale, setting her up for a devastating fall when reality intruded. Anastasia was a narcissist of imperial proportions. She loved her children, yes, but she loved them as extensions of herself. When they pleased her, they were Romanovs. When they disappointed her, they were Mecklenburgers. She used people like she used poker chips, playing them when they were useful, discarding them when the hand was lost. The Count of Wenden, her illegitimate son Alexis, was the ultimate example of this. She birthed him to prove she could, she titled him to prove she won, and then she left him with nothing but a name that meant nothing in a new world. Yet, despite the selfishness, there is something undeniably compelling about her refusal to be crushed. In an era when women were legal property, transferred from father to husband like cattle, Anastasia Mikhailovna refused to be owned. When the German court tried to silence her, she shouted louder. When the Russian court tried to shame her, she stared them down. When her husband couldn't give her a child, she went out and got one. She was a monster of agency. She took the script she had been handed, Silent German Wife, and she tore it up, writing a new one in bold red ink. It was a messy script, full of typos and errors, but it was hers. Today, the Villa Wenden in Cannes is gone, carved up into apartments or demolished for modern hotels. The tennis courts where she smashed balls at terrified opponents are now parking lots. The world she lived in has vanished so completely that it feels like a hallucination. The Romanovs are saints in the Russian Orthodox Church, martyrs to a lost cause. The Hohenzollerns are private citizens living quietly in Germany. The Grand Duchy of Mecklenburg-Schwerin is a historical trivia question, but Anastasia remains a vibrant, difficult, impossible ghost. She is the patron saint of the difficult woman. She reminds us that history is not just made by the people who follow the rules and sign the treaties. It is also made by the people who flip the table, spill the wine, and demand to be heard. She was not a good person. She was arguably a bad wife and a complicated mother. But she was alive. In the necropolis of 19th century royalty, where everyone was frozen in marble poses of duty and sacrifice, Anastasia Mikhailovna was a flash of heat, a burst of laughter, a cloud of cigarette smoke. She was a woman who looked at the dying light of the empire and didn't pray for salvation. She bet on black. And perhaps that is why her story still resonates, even as the details fade. We live in a world that is constantly telling women to be likable, to be appropriate, to have it all, without making a mess. Anastasia is the anti-heroine who reminds us that sometimes making a mess is the only way to prove you exist. She reminds us that reputation is a cage, and sometimes the only way out is to burn the house down. Imagine her one last time, standing on the balcony of the Villa Wenden in the twilight of 1921. The war is over. The Tsar is dead. The money is gone. She is old. Her heart is failing, and the cold wind of the Mistral is blowing in from the sea. She lights a cigarette, her hand trembling slightly. She looks down at the lights of the coast, the string of pearls that outlines the shore of France. She can hear the distant music from the casino, the siren song that called to her for 40 years. She knows the game is rigged. She knows the house always wins. She knows that in the end, death collects all the chips, the emeralds, and the titles, but she doesn't regret the bet. She doesn't regret the scandal. She doesn't regret the boy named Alexis or the man named Vladimir. She takes a drag of the cigarette and exhales the smoke into the dying light. I played, she whispers to the dark. My God, how I played. The wind catches the ash and scatters it over the garden, over the sea, over the ruins of a Europe that was too small to hold her.